Hello there. Let's do some practice questions for the CompTIA A Core 2 exam. And you're going to get my explanations and reasonings for why these answers are what they're going to be. But first, a little disclaimer. Darkbird Tech, this channel, is not affiliated with CompTIA or any partners. The following questions are meant to give practice in preparing for the exam. They are not actual exam questions and answers. All these questions have been created to provide a similar experience with how the knowledge will be tested in the exam. Any similarities is because of this. The way we're going to work is this. The questions will first appear. We will have a look at the question, and for some of them, I will give you an opportunity to think about the options you'd like to see. In other cases, though, we will need to see the options first before we can even think of trying to answer it. So then the options will appear. And we'll have a look at the options. We will work out what the right answer is, and then we take a sip of coffee before moving on to the next one. First up, a junior admin notices that their employer's servers are running an OS that has recently reached EOSL, which is end of service life or end of support life, but it's effectively the same thing. The OS is not getting updates anymore and needs to be upgraded. What should the technician do first? Well, there's probably plenty of things you can probably think of that they should be doing first. So this is definitely one of those questions where we need to see the options that are going to be presented to us in the exam. Initiate the change to upgrade, approve the change to upgrade, create a change proposal for the upgrade, or label the servers in the asset inventory as legacy. So before we get stuck into figuring out what the right answer is, let's take a step back and look at the question and the answers they're putting forward to us. This is a question that is testing to see if we can understand operational procedures. So we don't want to get too hung up over the fact it's an end-of-life operating system that we're dealing with here. This is more of a change management, change control type of question. Now, usually the process for doing a change is that you create and put forward a change proposal to the change advisory board. It gets approved, and then you initiate the change with the actual implementation of it. So in terms of order operations, it would be first to do C, second to do B, and third to do A. D is a little bit of a weird one. Now, the reason why I say D is a little bit of a weird one is you actually might go and do this if you decide to keep that legacy operating system running in the environment and actually continuing to use it. But the question is saying we want to upgrade. So that actually eliminates that. If the question said we are unable to upgrade due to some limitation, then option D would be a candidate here. Let's see. If I was a junior admin noticing that we have server OSs that have reached EOSL, I would probably put forward a change proposal for the upgrade to be done. Assuming my change proposal is good and viable, then we would look at doing B and then we would look at A. But usually a question like this is first thing to do. Cool, let's move on. Which of the following is a social engineering technique that often involves sending an electronic message to a specific user that focuses on manipulating that specific user? So our options are impersonation, spear phishing, vishing, and smishing. So let's see, social engineering, cool. All four of these are forms of social engineering, so that doesn't really help us eliminate these four options. Sending an electronic message, okay, well that will eliminate vishing straight away because vishing is usually a type of voice call, whether it be through traditional telephony or voice over IP. Now, the next part is specific user and manipulation of that specific user. This makes me feel spear phishing is the right option here, because spear phishing is a variant of normal phishing that focuses on one person and trying to manipulate that one person. So instead of being a mass mail saying, hey, here's an easy way to make money online, click here to learn my secret, it's more a case of, hey Bob, hey Susie, assuming Bob and Susie are the recipients. Some sob story that targets them directly. So spear phishing is the better option here. It could be smishing, but it also could not be. If it was something like an email or maybe an instant message on a more enterprise platform, then technically it wouldn't be smishing. The only thing they gave us here was electronic message. So it could be, could not be, 50-50, can't make a guarantee there. Impersonation, it could have been that, but the question is, was the attacker actually impersonating somebody that this targeted individual knows? Again, the question doesn't stipulate that, so we're going to eliminate that. Spear phishing is the best fit considering it is an electronic message and is targeting one specific individual. So that's the best answer there. Next up, a technician is setting up a newly issued Windows workstation. When attempting to launch a legacy business application, an error message appears indicating that a required Microsoft.NET component is missing. What is the most appropriate way to fix this issue? So hopefully you're thinking up a couple of cool ways to try and fix something like this, but let's see what options we have. Option A, enable the required .NET component using the Windows Features control panel setting. That seems like a pretty good option, but don't get too hung up on the first option even if it looks good. Read the rest, just to make sure there's not a better one hiding in the rest of them. Option B, obtain the missing component from an unofficial third-party download site. The fact that it's unofficial third-party, I'm not liking that. That's dangerous. So let's take out option B. I'm not thrilled about that even before I consider the rest. Option C, install the newest available version of .NET instead of the requested one. You see, the thing about the .NET framework is if an application requires 3.5, installing 4.0 won't help. So yes, technically you are installing a .NET framework, but it's got to be the correct version for the business application. The thing is, the application is looking for the way the particular version it needs was set up. So let's say 3.5 for instance. And things might have been deprecated, removed, or altered in 4.0 that application needs. So not a great option. At least they're installing the required utility, but it's not necessarily going to fix the issue. Option D is to escalate the issue to the security operations team due to potential malware risk. This is something an organization might consider having to do if you need to be hyper secure and on top of your applications and application version control to minimize risk. But it's not going to fix the issue. Besides which, this is a legacy business application. I assume a decent risk analysis and appropriate controls have been put in place to handle the security implications of said legacy application. And the question is asking us to fix the issue, not to make the environment more secure, to fix the issue. And sometimes you're going to be working in a position where other people in other teams and departments have already done their due diligence, and now it's up to you just to do your part of the bargain, which is option A, enable the required .NET component that's been missing through the control panel setting. Now that's not to say don't speak up and say, hey, have we reviewed this from a security perspective, because maybe not. But if it turns out the organization is doing due diligence and taking their cybersecurity very seriously, then don't worry about it too much. At some point you probably will get to that level if cybersecurity is your goal. Moving along though. Of the below, which would allow for the easiest upgrade from a previous release of Windows to the most current release without losing settings or data that is on the computer? So this question, we definitely need to see the options. We can't try and make a best guess. So option A is an image deployment. Option B is a clean install. Option C is a refresh. And option D is an in-place upgrade. So let's review some of the key things in the question here. Easiest upgrade path from old to new versions of Windows without losing settings or data. So in other words, we don't want to have to go and reconfigure stuff, reinstall stuff, and restore data that we hopefully had backed up. Cool. Which means a clean installation is off of the table. A clean install means I'm going to either have a brand new hard drive or I'm going to completely format and wipe the existing one. That means I'm going to have to redo all my settings. I'm going to have to reinstall applications. I am going to have to restore data. That is not the ideal answer here then. A refresh? Not an ideal option. And the reason why is because a refresh is sort of like a repair installation, but just made a lot easier nowadays, where the OS essentially reinstalls itself, but it's the same version that you have by the end of it. So not a great option. So that image deployment, that's not going to keep data and settings from a previous installation. What happens with image deployments is you are installing an operating system on a reference machine, doing a little bit of post-installation setup, like installing applications and utilities that all the users would need, and then capturing that custom image so that when you use that image, the next time you install, you're going to have a little bit of that post-installation actions and tasks done because it's built into the custom image. So yes, that does make your life easier, but it doesn't keep settings from the previous install. It keeps the settings and the installed applications from the reference image. So an in-place upgrade is the best option. Now, one thing to watch out for a question like this is it's actually a very, very straightforward question, but a little bit of obscure wording makes it sound a little bit harder to understand. So just take your time with some of these questions, read them carefully, and as you're going through the question, or reading it a second time maybe, ask yourself, how could I word this simpler? How could I word this more straightforward? And that might make your life a little bit easier. Which filing system could be used for a USB flash drive that is expected to be used on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS computers? This should be interesting. So we've got APFS, we've got FAT32, we've got NTFS, and we've got REFS. So first of all, let's quickly make a note of which operating system these particular file systems are associated with. So APFS is Apple's file system, based on the original filing system used by Unix, which was called HFS. NTFS, or New Technology File System, is exclusively for Microsoft, although you can install support packages in Linux and some BSD Unix variants that will allow them to support it. Then you got REFS, or the Resilient File System, which is again another Microsoft exclusive. It's only really available to you if you're using Windows Server. So those actually are out of the equation. Whereas FAT32, a lot of you might say it's Windows only, but actually most operating systems do support it, and even some embedded systems. So in the case of working for Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, FAT32 is the best answer. APFS is basically Apple only. NTFS and REFS are mostly Windows, although NTFS can work on Linux and BSD Unix flavors. But again, not out of the box necessarily. Depends on the default installed packages and services for the particular Linux distro or BSD Unix flavor you're looking at. Cool. Next up, an organization wants to ensure that their password policy is being adhered to throughout the entire organization. Which of the following would be the best way to ensure this is implemented fully? So let's see. We have a local security policy, we have a firewall, we have group policy, and we've got a password manager. So let's see. Organization. I'm going to assume if we are dealing with an organization, they have a domain. Whether it be a local domain controller or something like Microsoft's Entra ID, I'm not too bothered by that. But I'm going to go on the assumption we have a domain. Okay. And we want to ensure a password policy is being adhered to. Now, one of the best ways to ensure a password policy is being adhered to is to force users to comply with it. Not to check that users are actually doing what's right, but to force them to do it. If I go to our users and say to them, hey guys, please make sure your password is at least 8 characters, please make sure you've got complexity, blah, blah, blah. The problem is, if I haven't got a guardrail that forces them to also do that, all I'm doing is I'm just speaking to the audience and hoping that they're going to listen. If I let the users choose whatever they want as a password, I promise you, you're going to have terrible password security. Okay, so we want to have something hard and preventative. Now, a firewall isn't really going to do much good for us here. Firewalls are network security appliances that are going to monitor communications and make sure they're complying and adhering to a set of rules in the network. But the firewall's job is not to check your password. It's to make sure that malware and weird other types of network threats are not making their way through. And blocking protocols and services we know are inherently unsecure. So not a great answer there. Password managers, although they can be a useful utility and very helpful in some situations, if I don't have control over the password manager settings, the users can choose to have terrible passwords stored in a password manager and handled by that password manager. So that's not necessarily going to help that much. A policy template applied to the user's computers would work pretty well. Now, both local security policy and group policy work pretty well for this because both allow us to create password requirements. But I'm more inclined to go for a group policy than a local security policy. And the reason why I'd rather go for a group policy here is I go create a group policy and I can then go and tie that group policy at any point in the domain scheme that I want to. I can apply it to individual sites, organizational units, or domain or even forest level wide. So group policy is a better option here. Now we have a technician that notices a Windows service starts briefly but then terminates during execution. To identify why the service is failing, the specialist needs to review detailed system and application error information. Which tool would be used to diagnose the cause of this behavior? So cool, this is a question checking to see how well you know what different tools in Windows can be used for when it comes to troubleshooting. So let's see what we have. We've got Event Viewer, we have got Task Manager, we have got Services, and we have got Process Explorer. Let's look at the question before we go and look at all the options again. So we want to identify the service that's failing, and we want to see detailed information about the system and the applications and any error information that they might be presenting us, which when you're troubleshooting a failing service can be very, very useful. So Event Viewer, this is the log utility in Windows. And if you've explored it a little bit, you will see that it has a bunch of categories, including system and application logs, and errors are one of the categories or labels that is used to describe the messages in Event Viewer. So that can be very useful for us. So this is definitely a strong contender. Then we've got Task Manager. Now, Task Manager won't give us too much insight apart from when the service actually stops running. Task Manager is more useful when you're trying to see what's using up all your resources and what your system's performance looks like, and when an application is misbehaving, ending that process manually rather than closing it. But Task Manager is not going to help us a lot with service troubleshooting. The closest it will get us to is there is a services option in Task Manager that basically opens up this window, the services option. Now, the services admin console, dialog box, window, whatever you want to call the thing, can help us with information about how the service starts, any accounts it runs with, what dependencies it might have. Remember, a dependency is when the service you're looking at requires something else to already be running for it to function. But the services window or utility is not going to tell you why an application is terminating, especially considering that they describe a situation where the service starts but then terminates while it's running or executing. So although it's a useful tool, and I probably would look at it, it's not necessarily going to guarantee me a lead to the root cause of the problem and therefore helping me troubleshoot. Now, Process Explorer is a really, really cool tool and can actually help with troubleshooting stuff like this, but the catch with it is it's not native to Windows. You can download and install it, but it's not part of Windows by default. So even though it could help, it actually is outside of the scope of A+. It's more of a Security Plus conversation. So this is a bit of a red herring to try and take you off the path to the best answer. The best answer is Event Viewer. And the reason why we consider it one of the better answers here is because it lets me see log information. I can see the info messages, the warning messages, and the error messages to do with systems, applications. Even the security logs could reveal some insight into why this service is prematurely terminating. An employee is leaving an organization, and IT is responsible for completing the user deprovisioning process. Okay, cool. Which of the following actions are typically included when revoking the departing employee's access? Choose two. Now remember, when you're doing a CompTIA exam, you're going to get some questions where you have to choose two or more options. The good news is they do tell you in the question, choose this many. So that does make your life a little bit easier in that regard. So we've got quite a few options here. Option A is to disable the employee's physical building access credentials. Sounds good. Option B is secure and isolate the storage device from the employee's workstation. Option C is permanently delete all personal and company data related to the employee. That seems a bit weird, but we'll circle back once we've read all the other options. Option D, place the employee's email account on hold or disable it. Option E is to shut down the Ethernet ports at the employee's former workspace. So probably like closing down the switch port that they were connected to. And option F is block the network adapter's hardware address on the employee's computer. Couldn't they have just said block the MAC address? That would have been way easier. Anyway, let's review. We need two, so don't forget that. We're not after one answer here, we're after two good answers. So preventing the departing employee from having physical access to the building by revoking credentials like their physical access card, that's a pretty good option. I like that. Securing and isolating the storage device from the employee's workstation, that's a bit weird. Why not just take the employee's workstation? You're going to be reallocating it anyway. So I don't see why that's an option here. So I'm not too thrilled about that one. Permanently deleting all personal and company data related to the employee. I don't think that is something you'd be doing. In fact, I think that's the exact opposite of what HR wants to do. I've seen on a lot of HR systems that you can actually mark whether you would rehire that employee after they've departed. So you'd probably want to keep that information for a period of time. And for those of you who are about to scream at me about various privacy regulations and stuff like that, you are allowed to keep former employees PII for a period of time for a variety of reasons. You're not allowed to sell that stuff, you're not allowed to abuse that stuff, but you are allowed to keep it for a period of time. Remember, one of the key tenets of most privacy regulations, especially the stricter ones like GDPR, is that there must be a defendable and justifiable business reason or operational need to have that personally identifiable information. So I can very easily argue that we need that so that we know whether we actually want to rehire that person in the future if they come back asking for a job again. Or if police come investigating some sort of financial fraud that person might have been performing, and I can say, yes, they worked here and they did the following things, and. So there's a variety of reasons why I'd want to keep that stuff. Placing the employee's email account on hold or disabling it. That's a pretty good option. That could be very useful. All right. Shutting down the Ethernet port at the employee's former workspace. So turning off the switch port that they were connected to. I'm not thrilled about that because if they're on a laptop, they're probably connected through the Wi-Fi, which means that shutting down a switch port is not going to do much good apart from maybe just killing the wireless access point that the employee is connected to. But that's going to mess with all the other people that are still working there. So I'm not thrilled about that. Blocking the network adapter's hardware address of the employee's computer, in other words, blocking their MAC address. That is something you could consider doing because it would, on their last day, limit their ability to, for example, transfer data out of the workplace or something like that. So I could see that being part of a deprovisioning process. So I've narrowed it down to 3 good candidates, but we're looking for 2. So in that case, if I do have a couple options that feel good, but I need only 2 of these 3 in this example, I'm going to go for disabling the employee's access to the building and then placing their email account in some sort of hold or disabled state. The reason why I'm going to go for those 2 is because they definitely would be useful. On the employee's last day, once they're swiped in, we prevent that access card from being used to swipe in ever again. They can swipe out, or maybe we take it from them during their exit interview and then have them escorted out by security. Obviously in a nice way. It's not like they did anything wrong apart from resigning. And then placing their email account on hold or disabling it could be very useful so that we can ensure that we can retrieve any emails because we didn't delete it, but no more communications can come or go, especially if they've got that work email signed in somewhere like maybe on their personal computer at home or on their smartphone. Suddenly it stops working. So they can't use it as a way to, I don't know, exfiltrate data, impersonate themselves by pretending to act like they still work there and cause some problems for the organization. Those two do seem like the best option. Next, which of the following are system folders or directories on a macOS computer? Choose two. So we've got /system, /etc, /lib, /system32, /applications, and /home. Now, if you are familiar with macOS, you will probably find this to be a very easy question. If you're not, process of elimination can work out pretty well for you. First of all, System32, this is a name you will see in a Windows computer. But Microsoft does not use the / as the delimiter or separator between folder names. Microsoft uses the \, so that's actually wrong. Completely new. Okay, now that leaves us with system, etc, lib, applications, and home. Now something you want to remember about Apple is Apple wants to be user-friendly. Apple wants to be straightforward. Apple wants to make your life easier with macOS. Now, that means that avoiding acronyms and abbreviations that can be very confusing, and using technical terms is basically the opposite of what Apple wants to do. So if we look at things like etc and lib, that's not very friendly. That's not very easy to understand. In fact, both of these directories are from Linux. Linux follows the Unix ethos of keeping typing to a minimum. So everything gets abbreviated or turned into an acronym or something like that. So definitely not Apple-centric. Okay, so that leaves us with system and applications and home. All three are pretty straightforward names, but the thing is, home is another Unix Linux thing. Home is the directory or folder, if you prefer the term folder, in Unix and Linux where your user folders will be. So each user has their own subfolder or subdirectory within home, and within there will be documents, pictures, downloads, desktop, stuff like that. So Unix, Linux, but definitely not Apple. Applications and system are the two folders or directories that you'll find in an Apple system. Now, for those of you who already are familiar with macOS and saw those two straight away and were like, yeah, great stuff. That's an easy question for you. For those of you who are not lucky enough to be familiar with an Apple system, well, process elimination and knowing Windows and Linux at least helps you out a little bit here. Also, something worth thinking about is that in the exam, there are no typos. Every keystroke is intentional. So the / on System32, completely wrong and a red herring. And the fact that system and applications were the only two that were capitalized in their name, whereas the rest are all lowercase, also could have been a clue that could have helped give it away to you. Not strictly correct or technically accurate, but it is a little thing that could have helped in a question like this. So don't neglect basic familiarity with macOS and fundamental understanding of Linux and a good understanding of Windows. The large majority of workplaces that you will end up at will probably be using Windows as a client-side operating system. So obviously A+ is going to test more Windows, but you might have the occasional Mac OS user, you might have the occasional Linux user that you need to support. Besides which, if you do progress into more senior roles like doing full-on system administration, which is just a fancy way of saying you're a server admin, you might end up doing a lot more Linux administration than you're originally anticipating. I don't know what your career holds because I don't know where you're going to work one day. A user reports that their smartphone has become noticeably slower. Apps take several seconds to open, and moving between open applications is sluggish. What should the technician do first to begin troubleshooting the issue? I'm pretty sure you've got a couple of good ideas here, especially if you've encountered this yourself. But let's see what the options are. Option A is to restore the phone to factory settings, basically a factory reset. That seems a bit extreme, but let's carry on. Restarting the phone, reviewing the current battery health status, and option D, to remove unused or rarely used applications. Okay, now there is something in the real world that I would deal with first, and that is I'd ask the user, is this recent, or has this phone been getting slower and slower and it's just reached a point where now you're bringing it to me? And the reason why I'd like to know that is if this isn't all of a sudden thing, that can make my life a lot easier by looking at what was the most recent thing done. Was there an application installed? Was there an update applied? Or was a setting changed recently that could have led to a very sudden performance decrease? But if it's been slowly bubbling up and boiling up over time, again, that's important to know because there can be the possibility that this phone is really old. And then the next question is, well, how old is the phone? It's only natural that after about 2 to 3 years, you will notice your phone is a lot slower, partly due to the fact that you're just used to its current level of performance and it just becomes your baseline of normal. And compared to other people who might have newer or better models than you, yours will feel slower. And then obviously there's the fact that software updates expect more of the hardware, and obviously the hardware doesn't magically upgrade like a desktop could be, or a laptop even. So you're limited in your hardware on a phone. But that's beside the point. Those questions are not going to help us answer this question. So let's have a look at the options. What we want to do while we're looking at these options, though, is bear in mind that they're asking what should we do first to begin troubleshooting. And the reason why I want to draw your attention to the part of the question that asks you what should you do first is because all 4 options are viable. Doing a factory reset can do a lot of good to breathe new life into a phone because you're getting rid of all the crap that builds up on a phone that you didn't realize was building up there. But it is a bit extreme, and I probably wouldn't do it first because there's going to be a lot of stuff you now have to do for that user. Reinstalling the apps that they need, signing into all of their accounts, fiddling with all the settings to get it back to the way it was before. That sounds like an onerous thing to do. Restarting the phone? That could work. The thing about most people and their phones is they leave their phones running 24/7. And because of that, stuff gets loaded into RAM and then closed, loaded again into RAM and closed. And then sometimes you get weird memory issues, like an application doesn't properly relinquish the RAM it was given. Sometimes weird things happen with the files loaded into RAM that were being used. Odd things happen. A restart once in a while doesn't do any harm. So that is a pretty good and low friction step for troubleshooting. I'm not changing anything. I'm not adding something. I'm not removing something. I'm not altering a setting of any kind. It's just a simple, let's try turning it off and on again and see if it behaves better. Especially because it can close a bunch of applications you have open in the background. So that's a pretty good option. Reviewing the battery health status, that could be useful because if I see something that the user doesn't use very often, has been using the battery quite a bit, apart from the screen, like an app has been eating the battery, that could also be eating up performance and slowing the device down. So that could give me a clue to the troubleshooting, but it's a bit of a flimsy one, so I'm not too thrilled about that one. And then removing unused or rarely used applications, that actually can help quite a bit there. Freeing up a bit of internal storage space on the phone will be a good thing, regardless of the phone's performance, because now the user has more space to use on their device. But a very interesting thing is that as a computer's storage fills up and gets closer and closer and closer to 100%, you start seeing weird performance issues start cropping up. It's often due to how the operating system manages the file system and the storage space underneath it. So that could help. So restarting the phone and removing unused applications, those 2 are very, very good first steps. But which would be my first step? Well, for me, it would be doing a restart on the phone. And the reason why is because it's a very, very low touch troubleshooting step. I'm not altering the device in any substantial way. And if it works, the user basically just carries on with their device as it was. Removing the unused applications or rarely used applications, this is a very, very strong second, in my opinion. And it would do the phone good regardless. So I'm going to go for option B. But the battery health thing, yeah, it could give you a clue, but beyond that, I wouldn't put too much weight behind that step. And then doing a factory reset. I would discuss that with a person as a final option if I am all out of ideas and theories, and I've even consulted colleagues and the internet. And I've got no better ideas yet. Now, an option that would have been interesting to see here would have been check their web browser on their phone. A very common thing I've seen with a lot of people is they'll have a load of browser tabs open, and every browser tab that you have open, even if you're not using it, is eating up a little bit of your RAM, and that can very quickly slow your phone down. But that option isn't here, so I can't consider that. But in the real world, check the person's browser. They might have like 40 tabs open, each with the website loaded that could be slowing the device down. A user is transferring files from a Linux system to a newly installed Windows PC using an external hard drive. When the drive is connected to the Windows computer, the operating system prompts the user to format the disk before it can be accessed. The drive functions normally when attached to the Linux machine. What actions should the user take to ensure the drive is usable on both systems? So I'll give you a chance to think about some of the options you might want to see here, because this is one of those questions where you could start formulating an answer before you see the options. So, our options are modify Windows security settings to permit Linux-based storage devices. If that is a setting, I have not come across it, but anyway, let's look at the other options. Replace the USB cable with one certified for Windows systems. Option C, install updated motherboard firmware on the Windows PC. Or option D, reformat the drive using a file system supported by both operating systems. Alright, so straight away I'm going to eliminate A because I have never seen an option like that. If it exists, please correct me in the comments, but I have not seen it. Option B, replace the USB cable with one certified for Windows systems. Now this actually can catch a couple people because when you look at hardware and peripherals, you often do see certified for Windows, certified for Mac OS and stuff like that on some of the packaging. But this will not make a difference really. Installing an update for your motherboard's firmware. That could help, especially considering this is a hardware issue, but this is an OS difference issue, not so much a hardware issue. If I got the same problem when I plugged this hard drive into one Windows computer and then another, that might be something that is hardware related. But because we've got a difference in the operating systems, I'm more inclined to believe it's option D, that we need to reformat the drive with a file system that both operating systems understand. This scenario they described here would be, for example, if you had something like the ext4 filing system that Linux uses, which Windows doesn't recognize. You'd probably want to look at something like FAT32 or exFAT. And depending on the Linux distro, maybe even NTFS, but again, that depends a bit on the distro. So reformatting the drive to a compatible file system should work. This is actually very similar to a question we had a little bit earlier. When a corporate laptop is connected to the company network, it can reach websites. When the laptop connects to the user's home network, it is unable to access any websites. Which of the following settings can be changed to resolve the issue? So I'll give you a chance to think about the options you'd like to see here. But first we have DNS settings, proxy settings, default gateway, and subnet mask. Now we are looking at a difference between a home network and a work network. Now when we're looking at network connectivity, we want to consider IP settings first and foremost. Now this will obviously include the IP address, the subnet mask, the default gateway, and the DNS server. But I'm not too inclined to believe it's the subnet mask or the default gateway. And the reason why I'd say that is both probably use DHCP. So that means that the settings get delivered to the client device when it does its discovery, offer, request, acknowledge exchange. So I don't think it's so much to do with those. What would be the biggest difference between the work network and the home network is the presence of a proxy server, especially if we are using a non-transparent proxy, or a traditional proxy as I like to call them. Now the reason why this would cause this issue is if it's a non-transparent proxy, you have to statically or manually configure the proxy server's address information on the client device. Now, when that setting is applied, the client device will always forward its web requests to the proxy server. Now, if the proxy server is not present or online, the requests get forwarded to nothing, and then you obviously don't get a response. And when the user goes home, and that setting is still enabled, the proxy server is not present at the home network, so the user fails to go online. But if we go into the settings and turn the proxy off, the user will probably be able to go online. So that's probably what's going on there. And this scenario is actually the reason why a lot of companies, businesses, and organizations tend to favor transparent proxies, where no client-side settings need to be done, and the network itself routes the web requests to the proxy. And then when the user goes home, their web request goes straight out onto the internet. No settings changes required at all. So the proxy setting is the most likely to be causing this issue. Next, a technician is troubleshooting network connectivity on a Windows workstation and needs to verify the system's IP configuration. Which command should be used? Now, this is a lovely question where you can probably start thinking about the answer before you even look down at the options presented. But let's see what the options are. We've got netstat, ipconfig, traceRT, and nslookup. And hopefully, those of you who remember your Windows commands are being drawn straight away to option B, ipconfig. ipconfig is the command that you use to look at your IP address, your subnet mask, your default gateway. And if you use the /all option, you will get additional information like your DHCP, your DNS, and all of that cool stuff. Netstat, that shows you incoming and outgoing TCP/IP connections. So that doesn't show you your address really though. You'll see it sometimes, but it's going to be kind of tricky to figure out, yeah, that's my address, that's my subnet mask, that's my whatever. And you might not even see the other information that ipconfig does present. traceRT, that is the command you use to check the IP addresses of every routing device in a pathway from yourself to the destination address you specified when you ran the command. So basically it's used to verify routing. And then nslookup, it's a little bit tricky to remember, but if you slip the D before the NS, you'll have DNS lookup, which is what it does. It lets you test domain names and the resolution of the name to the IP address, which is useful, but not used to verify your IP configuration. In fact, we're actually kind of lucky because the intended use of the command is its name, IP configuration. So that was a fairly straightforward one. A user reports frequent pop-up advertisements, browser redirects, and poor system performance. Which type of malware is most likely causing these symptoms? Now, one of the things you want to be careful about with questions like this is you might start thinking, well, how do we know it's malware? In the real world, that's a valid question. But when you're doing the exam, basically take it as granted that you now know it's malware causing these symptoms. That's what this question is testing. Can you categorize malware based on the symptoms, behaviors, and characteristics it exhibits? Now, our options are rootkit, worm, spyware, and adware. Rootkits are used to elevate to admin privileges, but it wouldn't really give you something so blatant and noticeable as advertisements, browser redirects, and it definitely would avoid eating up all your resources to avoid detection. A worm could cause this, but a worm is more about how the malware spreads than exactly what symptoms it gives you. Worms are self-contained files, and they are also self-triggering and will spread through the network autonomously. They are unlikely to do the advertisements and stuff like that. Worms are more about infection and causing damage. Spyware, again, would be very, very stealthy compared to what symptoms are being shown here. Spyware's job is to basically spy on you, recording keystrokes, screen activity, or network traffic, and would probably be doing its best to not be noticed. So it's not that. Now that leaves us with adware as an answer from process of elimination. But if we looked at adware and said, well, adware's job is to force unsolicited advertising on you, well, that is aligning with the fact that you're getting pop-up advertisements, your browser's getting redirected to a different site, and your system performance is being affected because usually people who develop adware do not develop with efficiency and good coding practices in mind. So adware is very likely the answer for this question. The symptoms match, and the behavior of adware is to force things onto your screen, try and get you to buy stuff. So that's the best answer here. A user is temporarily assigned to a new department and requires access to additional shared resources. What is the best way to grant this access? So if we take a step back after reading the question, this reads like a permissions management kind of question. How do I give people access to something, possibly temporarily? Now there's several different things to consider here, namely what type of shared resources are they, how are they hosted, and what type of controls do we have to adjust the permissions the various users would have. But we don't know that from this question, so we need to look at the options and work out, well, what would be the best answer given these options. So the first one is to assign local administrator rights, and that seems like a bit of an odd choice. Nowhere does it say that this temporarily assigned user is getting an administrator role in the company. So I'm not keen about that, and I can see some danger if that's what we do to temporarily grant access to a user. Adding the user to the appropriate security group, that could be a good option. If I add a user to the group that has the access to the shared resource they need, that will sort out the access requirement. But what about the temporary nature of their job assignment? Well, I could always remove them from that group in the future. So, choice is yours. Looks good. Option C, creating a new user account. Now I'm going to assume that if we create a new user account, the new account will have the access the user needs. And then when they no longer need that access because the temporary assignment is now done, I could always disable that user account. It's not a bad idea. But creating additional user accounts to handle resource access issues can create a bit of an auditing nightmare. And if we forget to disable that user account, well, we've now got a user account that's active and can access things that the account has been granted permission for. This reads like a security liability. So yes, it would work, but it's a security liability long term. Sharing files directly with the user for option D. That could work. When a user needs some access to something temporarily, somebody who does have access could send the file to the user, whether it be an administrator or somebody who's permanently assigned to that particular department or job role. But this is a very manual approach and also could be a issue security-wise, because if you have people who have access to files able to share them through some other method, like for example by email or a cloud share or something, to people who don't have access, that sounds like a bit of a security liability to me. Plus also, it's going to irritate and annoy the people that are trying to get their work done. Option B seems to be the most appropriate one, because if I add the user to the security group, and then they can access the resources. And then when their assignment to the new department is done, because remember it's temporary, we can always remove them from the security group. We just make a reminder of some kind to go and review and check at that date. So option B seems to be the best way to manage this. Next up, a Windows computer fails to boot after a recent driver installation. Which recovery option should the technician try first? This should be interesting. Now, chances are you're thinking up a couple cool options, but let's see if any of them appear here in the options presented. reset the PC, reinstall Windows, use System Restore, and update the BIOS firmware. Now, this is again another one of those questions where all four could be done. So they're asking us which should we try first. You might be lucky, CompTIA might emphasize the word first, but if they don't, remind yourself, highlight it, because the Pearson VUE exam engine does let you highlight things. Remind yourself, what step would you try first? And usually a good rule of thumb for troubleshooting, especially with things like this, is which is going to be the least impactful step I could try? Which one is least likely to cause bigger issues? And I'm sorry, but reinstalling Windows, that's a bit of a big deal. That's going to have a big impact. Assuming reinstalling Windows fixes the issue, I'm then going to have to go and redo user accounts, reinstall applications, sign into various things. There's a load of post-installation steps that I need to follow now, and that can take a significant amount of time, and that is not an ideal thing for my first step. So I might do that, but maybe once I've exhausted all other options that are going to be quicker and simpler and less impactful. Reset this PC. I'm going to assume they're talking about the option in the Windows recovery menu, and that can work, but it's just a milder version of reinstalling Windows. You can keep application settings and user account information, but it will revert the operating system quite substantially. So I'm not too thrilled there. Now we've got System Restore and updating BIOS firmware. Updating BIOS firmware is another decoy for us. And the reason why I say it's a decoy is because they're talking about a recent driver installation, making you think, ooh, hardware-related, firmware-related issue. Which it could be, but I doubt updating the BIOS firmware would fix this. You can often go for quite a few years worth of driver updates before the BIOS firmware ever receives an update, never mind needs it for compatibility. System Restore would actually be a pretty good option here. The reason why I like System Restore for this is because when you're doing a major installation, like for example, installing a new application, updating an important app or service like a driver, or doing a major configuration change, and you've got the System Restore utility enabled in Windows, before that operation takes place, Windows creates a restore point, so that if anything goes wrong, and you can access System Restore in the recovery menu, you can revert the machine back to that point in time. And a driver installation would trigger the Windows System Restore utility to create a restore point. So that could be a pretty quick and easy first step. Also, considering this is the most recent thing to be done, it is unlikely we're going to lose any other configurations and application installations by going back to the restore point. So this is the least impactful way to start troubleshooting the scenario. If System Restore doesn't work, I might try something else. I might try, for example, and get into safe mode and manually uninstall the driver. I might try the BIOS update. I might try resetting. Eventually, I might land up at reinstalling the whole computer, which is something I'd hope to avoid. But I could try different things once I have exhausted the simpler, less impactful things. And System Restore is the least impactful here. A user receives an error stating they lack permission to install software on their workstation. What is most likely the cause? Now, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, that could be a pretty good answer. Let's see what options are presented. Option A, the installer file is corrupted. Option B, the system is missing required dependencies. Option C, antivirus software is blocking the installation. Or option D, the user is not a member of the administrators group. Now, a lot of you were probably thinking that the user is not a member of the administrators group. And that is the most likely reason why a user would get told they lack permissions to install some software on their workstation. But the other options are all viable. It could be that the installation file that was downloaded is corrupted, but that happens very, very rarely. Possible, but rare. The system missing required dependencies? Well, then you would probably get an error message telling you what's missing, or at least that something is missing that needs to be installed, not that you lack permissions. The one that is most close to lacking permissions might be the antivirus software blocking the installation, and you lack the permissions or rights within your AV to enable the installation to take place. That or the AV has detected a potential malicious component as you were installing it and is blocking that installation. But if it was that, then the antivirus would probably be telling you, hey, this thing's malicious, I'm not letting it happen. Option D is the best answer here, simply because it's the most aligned with the error message that we received, not these three. That's a pretty straightforward one. Looks more complicated than it actually is. And this question popping up somewhere in the middle or latter part of your exam can feel a lot tougher than it should, because you're a little bit mentally worn out and probably have been dealing with a bunch of scenario questions that have really turned your head around. So let's move along. A technician is decommissioning a company laptop that will be resold. Oh, cool. Which action best ensures that sensitive data cannot be recovered? So, option A is to delete all the user files. Option B is to perform a quick format. Option C is to replace the hard drive. And option D is a normal format. Now, there's two good approaches here that could be used. One is amongst the options. The other one is actually not listed here, but it is a good practice. So first, let's just eliminate the bad options. First up, deleting user files doesn't do much. Data recovery is a thing, and if I've just deleted important files but left everything else the same, that stuff can be recovered, and there's likely also to be settings and configurations present that won't be deleted like user files would be. And that stuff could be very useful in the wrong hands. Performing a quick format, not a great way to delete data. On a deep technical level, what happens with a quick format is it just wipes out the file index table that most file systems maintain, which makes it look like the storage media is empty, but the actual files themselves are still present. It's like, for example, if I went to a textbook and ripped out the table of contents, it makes it look like there's nothing in the book then, but actually it's still physically got all the other pages and stuff in the book. Performing a normal format, that can work, sort of, for a situation like this. And the reason why is a normal format will go and clear both the file index table and the files themselves, and place a new file system there ready to be used. The problem, though, is it does not overwrite normally. That's what you want out of a format for this type of scenario. You want something called a forensic format, which is like a normal format, plus it overwrites the drive, ensuring that certain data recovery software that looks for historical changes to the storage media to recreate the files is unable to see the original data. So if that option was present, that would be a pretty cool one. But the best option here is to replace the entire drive. And on a personal level, that is my preferred approach to dealing with resale, refurbishment, or donation of old enterprise equipment. The rest of the computer is fine. It probably doesn't have much, if anything, sensitive that would be a security risk for the organization. And taking out the old hard drive and sticking in a new one that's never been used for work purposes at all, it was literally bought specifically for this purpose, wouldn't be a bad idea. But then what do you do with the old hard drive? Well, you either store it somewhere, do that forensic destruction, or better yet, physically destroy it before you send it off for e-waste recycling. But if that cost of replacing the old drive with a new one to protect the company's data security is too expensive, well, then the forensic format would be a good option. But remember, we're looking at the options presented in the question. Even if there is a nice answer outside of the options or a better choice, go with what's the best option CompTIA presents. It's one of the biggest challenges you'll have writing this exam, or actually any certification exam, where you know there's a better choice, a better approach, but it's not listed amongst the options. Go for the options that are presented and choose the best one there. This actually does help in the real world because you might have limiting factors that are not part of the question, but would make that the ideal choice in your real life workplace experiences. A technician discovers malware on a user's workstation connected to the corporate network. What should the technician do first? Okay, this is interesting because this is a process/security question, which is dealing with what's the order of operations for incident response when it comes to malware. So our options are disconnect the system from the network, delete the infected files, run a full antivirus scan, and re-image the workstation. Now what's pretty cool is all four options are things you could and probably would end up doing when responding to a malware infection. So what do we pick? Well, if we go back to our question, it's asking us again, what's the first step? What's the first thing I want to do? And the first step you want to go with is disconnecting the system from the network. Isolation or containment, whichever term you prefer, is a very common first step for most security issues. Now, the reason why that is usually the first step is whether it's a hacker that's gained access to your environment or malware that's come in somehow, what you want to do is prevent the security issue from getting worse. So disconnecting the system from the network would help with that. In this case, they're saying it's malware. And by disconnecting the system from the network, you are physically preventing the malware from spreading to other systems. Now, the malware could still carry on running and doing its malicious actions on the current computer that's infected. But it will not be able to create new infections, which means at least you've limited the damage and the impact that is being caused. Now, the next thing would be to then go through the appropriate removal process based on what you have been able to discover and figure out about this malware. Now, whether that be re-imaging the workstation and restoring the user data, or going and destroying the individually malicious files, that would probably be part of your remediation and removal process. And then running a full antivirus scan, that can be part of remediation and removal, or part of your tidy up to make sure that the malware is gone. But these would be done after containment. So good options, good things to do. But the question asked us, what are we going to do first? And the first step with security incidences, whether it be malware or otherwise, is always to isolate or contain so that it doesn't keep getting worse. At least at this level. When you do a more focused and sophisticated cybersecurity course, there are some extra steps that happen before this. Next question. A technician is using AI to create a user guide for a newly adopted business application. After reviewing the AI's output, they notice that there is incorrect information and references to other unrelated applications. What is this an example of? Let's see what the options are. First, data privacy. Second option, option B, is hallucinations. C is appropriate use, and D is glazing. So let's review the scenario. The technician is using AI. Now, in terms of should a technician be using AI to create a user guide or not, that is not the question being asked here. So appropriate use is straight away eliminated. Using AI to do a task that's quite mundane, monotonous, and annoying is basically what AI is intended for. Okay? Now let's look at the outputs part of the question. After reviewing the AI's output, they notice that there is incorrect information and references to completely unrelated things. This reads like a hallucination. Hallucinations are when the AI models, especially LLMs, start making things up, misinterpreting the prompt, whatever. Basically, spitting out incorrect information but acting like it's correct. That's an AI hallucination. And it's also one of the big risks of AI adoption. When somebody who doesn't have any idea about the prompt they've given to this model, they will believe it to be correct. Some of you might remember when one of Google's AI models was busy encouraging people to put wood glue as a topping for pizza. The problem is, we all look at that and laugh. But let's say it was something other than making a piece of food. Something that you wouldn't know whether that output, that answer, that guide is right or wrong. That could be very dangerous. And that is an example of why hallucinations are a big deal in the AI industry. Alright, but what's glazing? Glazing is when the AI model tells you how awesome you are, how fantastic your prompt is, and how clever you overall are. You're such an amazing person. It's ego boosting to try and make you like the model a bit more. Now, yeah, it's kind of nice to get told, oh, that was a good idea. But realistically, I don't need that ego boost from my tools. And data privacy? I don't see a data privacy issue here at all. The closest we get to data privacy concerns is that the technician is using it for a user guide, but I'm not giving it the user's data, and I'm not telling it about anything sensitive or internal. It's just a user guide for a newly adopted business application. And the fact this is an adopted application means that you didn't develop it, so there's no data privacy issues. Cool. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Some of you might not be very keen on AI. Some of you might be very enthusiastic about AI. Regardless of which camp you fall on, or if you're like me and you sit on the fence somewhat, leaning towards one side a little bit, AI is here to stay. AI is not going away anytime soon. It's like the dot-com bubble. A lot of you probably were not around or not old enough to remember it, but there was a lot of hype around having a website on the internet, hence why we call it the dot-com bubble. When that bubble burst, it was not pleasant from an economic perspective or an industry perspective, but websites remained. The internet survived. So AI is probably going to go the same route. It might carry on the current trajectory. It might get a bit of a reality check, come back down to earth, and be used more realistically and feasibly, but it's definitely not going away anytime soon. So be prepared to deal with AI in the workplace. A user reports that their browser homepage resets after every reboot, and unknown extensions reappear even after removal. Antivirus scans detect no active threats. Which action should a technician take next? This is interesting, because at first it read like malware, and I still have this like adware itch in the back of my mind here. So let's see what options we have. Restore the system from a backup, boot into safe mode and run an anti-malware tool. Option C, disable browser synchronization, and option D, reinstall the browser. These can be pretty good options. So let's have a look at the question and the scenario again. The browser homepage keeps resetting after every reboot. So it sounds like the user's trying to fix it and they shut their computer down, start it up the next day, and it's back to the same behavior. And I'm assuming the extension they're talking about is a browser extension or a plugin. So it keeps appearing and reappearing even after removal. But the antivirus is not detecting anything. So the symptoms sound like adware. But we also seem to have something that's trying to gain persistence and stealth. So persistence is where the malware has a way of just staying there no matter what. And the fact that the antivirus is not picking up on it means that this thing is stealthy, possibly even a 0-day. But generally, the hacking community will not waste a 0-day vulnerability on adware. They'll use something a bit more targeted and a bit more impactful. So I'm still more inclined to believe it's stealth. But now I'm overanalyzing the malware, which is something for Security Plus or CISA. So let's have a look at the options we've got. Restoring the system from a backup, that could be part of my remediation process. Booting into safe mode and running the anti-malware tools, that could work. And the reason why is if something is persistent and stealthy, it's probably leveraging one of the more advanced features in the operating system. And going into safe mode will keep the absolute bare minimums to have a functional operating system running, which would make it more likely that we'd be able to detect the malware. Disabling browser synchronization, that could help if this person has signed into an account, like for example your Google account on Google Chrome. That disable of synchronization could help because if the other computer that you're signed in on has the infection, that synchronization could be why it keeps happening. And reinstalling the browser, that could also work. Removing it and reinstalling it could solve the issue. Usually the adware is something separate and a third application, basically. Not the browser, not its extensions, it's something else on your system that's busy hiding. So I'm inclined to go for either A or B. Now, what should we do? A or B, A or B? Well, the question says, which action should the technician take next? This is another way of saying, what's the first step to figure out, is this really malware or are we being hyper paranoid here? Even though the antivirus scan doesn't detect anything, doesn't mean we're not dealing with malware. I'm going to go for booting into safe mode and running the anti-malware tools so that we can try and pick up on the malware if it's there. Maybe I'll do a restore of some kind from a backup or something. Maybe I'll turn off the synchronization. Maybe I'll reinstall the browser. All of these are viable at some point, but the question is asking me what should I do next. And what I want to do is confirm I am dealing with malware. And safe mode with the anti-malware tools being used within safe mode could definitely be a good next step. A technician needs to identify which process is currently listening on TCP port 443 on a Windows system. Which command should be used? So our options are ipconfig, netstat, traceRT, and ping. Now these options are familiar and similar to a question we had earlier. Don't let that mess with you. That is a common thing that can happen in the exam. So let's see, we're looking for something listening on a particular TCP port, specifically 443. 443 is HTTPS, but that doesn't seem to be very relevant to the question. This is again a question testing to see, do you know your commands and what they can do. ipconfig, very useful, but not in this situation. ipconfig is going to show me the setup, the configuration of my IP address and all that stuff on my computer. Netstat, however, this is the better option, I think, because netstat lets me see what active connections I have and something that's listening for requests coming in. That is going to appear under netstat results depending on the options you use. So that's a good answer there. traceRT is the one that lets me check routing because it shows me the IP address of every layer 3 device that forwards my traffic. But that's not what we're looking for here. And ping is not going to show you the process on the back end. Netstat's the best answer because it will show me the process or application that is busy making this network activity, or in this case, preparation for network activity, occur. Next up, a legacy Windows application fails to run on Windows 11 due to deprecated system calls. Which solution allows the application to run without modifying the host OS? Let's see. We've got compatibility mode, we've got virtual machine, we've got registry editing, and a firmware update. So I'll give you a chance to think about the answer. But straight away I'm going to eliminate a firmware update. Updating firmware is unlikely to make any difference for a legacy application that's having a problem with deprecated system calls. So completely out of the equation. Option A, B, and C at least are all to do with getting an application running. Now, one of the constraints they put on us in the question is we need to do this without modifying the host OS. So registry editing, oh yeah, I'm definitely taking that out. First of all, I am very reluctant to encourage editing anything in the registry unnecessarily. When it is necessary and there's no other way to do something than making a manual alteration to the Windows registry, then you do that. But if there's an option that lets you get the outcome you want without screwing around in the registry, I would go for that first. So that definitely is modifying the host OS, and they want us to do this without modifying the host OS. Now, compatibility mode can work to get legacy applications running on a more modern version of Windows. However, if it's a deprecated system call, compatibility mode is less effective because at the end of the day, the system call is looking for something that is no longer present or no longer presented in the same way. Also, they mentioned host OS. That's actually giving you a clue to the preferred answer here, a virtual machine. Oftentimes, when you're dealing with a legacy application that really doesn't want to run on the newest version of Windows that you are on, having a VM to run that legacy application is probably going to be the most seamless, guaranteed way to get it working. There are some downsides, however. Number one, you do need to have a reasonably powerful computer to run a VM so that you can run Windows 7, for instance. Let's just say it's Windows 7 for the sake of discussion. That's the first challenge. You need to be able to run your current system and be able to run essentially a second mini computer. The second problem is you now need to worry about managing legacy risk within a VM. Just because you're running, for argument's sake, Windows 7 in a VM, doesn't mean that all the security risks are gone from running Windows 7 by virtue of it being in a virtual machine. You still have to worry about that. Then you've got to worry about admin control, data privacy, and all of that. You still have to account for all of your security concerns, even though the legacy thing is running in a virtual machine. But this would probably be the most straightforward way to get this application running without modifying the host OS. A technician is instructed to apply an urgent configuration change outside of the normal change window. Which documentation is most important to complete afterwards? Okay, so just emphasize the fact this is afterwards. So we're more towards the end of a change control process. Now, you might be a little bit uncomfortable by me saying that because we've just been told to go and apply an urgent configuration change outside of the normal practices, but this will happen. You are going to have changes that will meet the requirements to be considered an emergency alteration and therefore be done outside of a normal change window and change management cycle. So, our options are asset inventory, incident report, change log, and knowledge base article. Take a moment if you need to think about it. But straight away, I'm going to eliminate the knowledge base article. Knowledge base articles are a fancier way of saying the documentation from troubleshooting being used as a resource and reference for future troubleshooting. Basically, your own internal database for Googling problems. This is not a troubleshooting situation. This is an emergency change that they're describing here. Incident report. They never said it was a security issue. And that's always for a security incident. So it's not an incident report in this case. Asset inventory, it won't be that because they never specified that we have acquired a new asset, hardware or software. It's a change to an existing asset. So by process of elimination, that's our change log. And if you're thinking, but hang on, updating the change log, isn't that also done during normal conventional changes that follow our standard practices that we have set for ourselves as an organization? Yes. Once the change is complete, you can revert back to normal practices, which is update the change log so that others know that this change has been done. So, cool. A little bit of understanding about normal operational practices and process elimination can help you work out answers like this where it might seem kind of hard to fathom and work out. In the actual exam, if you need to, flag this question and come back to it later on. Rather tackle the questions you know the answer to straight away, and then come back to the ones that you need to think about and figure out towards the end of your exam. A startup wants to keep their operating system licensing simple and low cost for client computers and servers. Which of the following operating systems would best meet their needs? I'm hoping you've already got a couple good ideas in your head, but let's see what they're talking about here. Mac OS, Chrome OS, Windows, and Linux. So they haven't gone for specific editions of any of these operating systems, like a particular version or edition of Mac OS or Windows. And they're not mentioning a particular distro of Linux. So that's good. Keeps our life a bit easier. So let's see, they want to keep it simple and low cost. Mac OS is not going to be that simple because you have to buy Apple computers. Plus, Apple doesn't really do much for server ecosystems anymore. So that's a bit of a problem for us there. Chrome OS, it definitely is low cost, but again, the server side of things. Chrome is highly focused on relying on Google's cloud services, whether it be personal Google account cloud services or whether it be G Suite or Google Workspaces or whatever the current name Google's decided to give this. So not a great answer there. That leaves us with Windows and Linux. Now, they're not focusing on usability or application familiarity. So I'm not going to worry too much about, oh, but people are more comfortable with Windows than Linux. They want simple, they want low cost. And the licensing for most distributions or versions of Linux is going to give them that. Now, yes, there are some particular distros of Linux that you do pay to use, but even when you do, they're relatively low cost compared to enterprise licensing from Microsoft. And that's assuming you choose to go for those. You can also go for distros where there is absolutely zero cost. So that would be great for a startup. And playing on stereotypes a little bit, if it's a startup, I'm going to assume it's a tech startup, and that would mean that the people working there are probably kind of comfortable working on Linux already. So yeah, this is going to be a pretty decent option here. Now, again, this is another one of those questions where you can step back and ask yourself, what are they testing? And they're basically just asking you, at a surface level, do you understand the various trade-offs when it comes to cost and licensing with different operating systems? With Apple, and to a certain extent Chrome OS, you have to buy the specific hardware to get that operating system. In the case of Mac OS, you've got to have an Apple computer, whether it be a MacBook or an iMac. With Chrome OS, you've got to buy a Chromebook. With Windows, yeah, you can get a little bit more flexibility in how you acquire Windows, because you can purchase Windows either at a brick and mortar store or purchase something off of Microsoft's website. You can get volume licensing either directly from Microsoft or through a reseller. But it's definitely not going to be simple, and it's probably not going to be low cost. Linux will be simple, Linux will be low cost, at least from a licensing perspective. Support and setup, well, that depends on how good you are with Linux. The same could be said for all of those operating systems. So yeah, definitely stepping back sometimes and asking yourself, what are they testing here with the exam objectives? Can help you understand the question in a clearer, more sensible way. A technician is installing Windows 11 on a new system. Which firmware requirement must be met for a standard installation? Now, something that could make you hang up on this question is the term standard installation. And that can mean many different things. It could be a particular definition within an organization where you might have a particular standard image that you deploy on all user computers. Or they could be talking about this is a pretty normal installation of Windows 11, nothing special, nothing fancy. So let's see what the options are and see if that gives us any better idea about how to answer this question. So make sure that legacy BIOS is enabled, having TPM 2.0 installed and enabled, MBR partitioning or master boot record partitioning, and using the FAT32 file system. So it seems they're just checking, do you know what your OS requirements are for installing it on any given computer? And straight away, I can eliminate the legacy BIOS mode. Windows 11 is modern enough that it'll support UEFI, and probably prefer that you have UEFI as your booting firmware. Then the FAT32 file system. Although it is supported, you're probably not going to use that as the file system for what becomes your C drive. More than likely, you're going to be rocking NTFS. MBR partitioning versus GPT partitioning, it won't make much difference. It's the TPM 2.0 requirement. This is one of the unique things that Windows 11 needs out of your computer to be a normal installation. Not long after the original release of Windows 11, Microsoft sort of made it possible for you to install Windows 11 Home Edition without a TPM 2.0 chip, just to alleviate some of the people that couldn't be able to upgrade because they didn't have a TPM chip or it wasn't a 2.0 chip. But Microsoft is going to make that more of a requirement going forward into the future. They've already started with Enterprise and Pro Edition for secure, properly supported installations. And at the end of the day, it's not going to take much for Microsoft to make that a full-time requirement. But yeah, TPM 2.0, one of the big deals and made a lot of headlines when it comes to Windows 11's requirements. So that's what that question is asking. A Windows system has multiple errors display after a new productivity tool is installed. Wonder what tool it is. Which recovery options allow for the simplest solution to this issue? Well, let's see what options they present us, and then we'll try and figure out which would be the easiest to work with. So we've got option A, system restore, option B, startup repair, option C, safe mode, and option D, last known good configuration. Now the thing is, this is an application presenting errors, and it doesn't seem to be affecting booting, which means startup repair and last known good configuration are probably not going to be the right answers here. The startup repair process goes and tries to repair things like your BCD files and some of the key executables that launch when Windows is booting. And then last known good configuration is an option that you get in the startup repair or recovery menu. So we're not having a problem here by the looks of it with the operating system booting, saying Windows is displaying errors. So it's unlikely that those two would be the right answer. That leaves us with safe mode and system restore. Now, safe mode could be part of the troubleshooting and diagnosis, but the thing is, it's just a bare bones version of the operating system. And chances are I will try launching this application, and assuming it could launch in safe mode, I will probably get the same errors appearing on the screen anyway. So safe mode probably won't do much unless it's an advanced Windows feature that might be causing an issue with this application. The simplest reversion back to a working state is a system restore point. Now I know that was an answer to a question we had earlier, but one of the things that can be a little bit off-putting is earlier system restore was the right answer for a driver issue. Now we're looking at an application installation issue, and you might think, well, I must use a different tool then. No, system restore is going to work for anything that is installed and could potentially cause an issue, whether it be a driver or an application or a significant configuration change. System restore points will be generated automatically prior to those events properly beginning, allowing you to revert or restore back to that point in time. And again, it's a quick and easy reversion. And in the question, they did state that this is a new productivity tool, so I don't think we're going to be undoing anything else by accident with this. The only time you've really got to be careful with system restore is if you have had several weeks go by before you go back to a restore point. That could be undoing quite a lot of other things inadvertently. But they did say this is a new thing and you're probably testing it, so probably nothing else has been done to the computer that's got this issue. Which authentication method provides the strongest protection against credential theft? Now, I'm hoping you're getting a couple of ideas popping into your head when it comes to authentication mechanisms or tools, but let's see what options they present before we get too carried away. So we've got a username and a password, we've got a smart card, we've got biometric authentication, and we've got multi-factor authentication. Now, all four of these are part of authentication tools and mechanisms we could look at using. So what we're looking for is the strongest to protect against credential theft. Now, some of you are probably thinking about these two, and both of them are good. But what we're really after here is something that's very, very difficult to compromise. And I'm going to say multi-factor authentication for this. And the reason why I'd say multi-factor authentication is a very common thing to do is a password. Now, that's a knowledge factor and technically stealable. But for it to be multi-factor, then the other factor must be something else, whether it be possession or biometrics, which actually means that D probably would include one of those two, in addition to having usernames and passwords. So this is basically a question where they're saying, do you know that multi-factor authentication is something you want to have, where the user's got to be able to do or provide two things to the system to be able to prove their identity. Even though biometrics and smart cards are really awesome, if I don't pair that up with something else, then all the attacker has to do is somehow clone the smart card or trick the biometric sensor, whether it be fingerprints, facial recognition, or something like that. Multi-factor would protect the best here, because the chance of an attacker being able to learn your password and fool a biometric sensor is pretty limited, or whatever the second factor might be. So multi-factor is the better choice here. Which command displays the routed path a packet will use to get to a destination? Now, considering we've had a few questions similar to this already, you're probably thinking of a particular answer, and if that answer is traceRT, congratulations, you got it right. But let's say this was the first question in this video that dealt with network commands and troubleshooting. Well, just as a reminder, traceRT shows the IP address of every layer 3 device, usually routers, but it could be firewalls, that your packet has passed through on the way to a given destination, whether that destination be an IP address or a fully qualified domain name. ipconfig, that just shows you your IP settings on a Windows computer. Ping verifies basic IP connectivity or layer 3 connectivity to a given destination. And netstat, as we said before, shows you your active TCP/IP connections, and some that might be in a listening state but not fully communicating. So that is our answer for that one. A company wants to prevent users from installing or running unauthorized software. Which solution is most effective? Well, there could be a couple of options, so let's see what's being put forward. Antivirus software, patch management, application allow listing, or firewall rules. Okay, all could work and all are security things, so let's go back to the question and just make sure we're very clear about what we're looking for. The company wants to prevent users from installing or running unauthorized software. Now, taking away admin rights definitely would stop a user from installing something they're not meant to have, but if the application is already installed, admin rights might not do much to stop the user from running an application or a utility that they are not meant to have access to. Okay, so that means we have to rely on one of these tools. An antivirus technically does stop applications from running, but only when it's flagged as being malicious. If the application is unauthorized, it doesn't mean it's malicious, it just is not something you're allowed to use at work. Like, for example, most employers probably don't want you playing video games. But I can guarantee you, most antivirus software won't recognize a video game as malicious usually. So that's not going to stop somebody from violating the acceptable use policy and running unauthorized software. Patch management, which is basically just the practice of managing and controlling how updates are applied and rolled out through your organization. I don't see how that's going to stop a user from running something they're not meant to run. It will be good because it means your system is going to have vulnerabilities being resolved, assuming the vendor does a good job keeping the systems patched and secured with every update. Application allow listing. Now, there are many applications that can do this. Some are native to your operating system, some will be third parties, but application allow listing generally works out really well because the way it functions is, by default, all applications and software is blocked. And you have to add the things you want to be able to use to a list that says these specific things are allowed. And the reason why we want to go with allow listing nowadays is the list of software we do want to be able to run in the workplace, no matter how long it might seem, is always going to be shorter than the list of software we don't want to run. And we can be pretty confident that we've covered it all. Let's use games again as an example. Most workplaces don't want users playing video games at work. Now, could you put together a list to block video games that covers every single possible video game that exists and ever will exist? Even if you are a gamer and are very familiar with a lot of games, including some obscure titles, well, there's going to be a new game launching tomorrow, next week, next month. You'll never be done creating a list that blocks things. But a list of things that says these things are allowed at work will always be something you can be confident that you've got to complete. It just might cause the occasional problem whenever a new workplace utility, application, or software is being deployed. So I'm going to go with that one. But why not firewalls and the firewall rules being used to block the software application? Well, the reason why I'm not going to go for the firewall is because all that will do is prevent the application that we're trying to block from communicating across the network. It won't stop the application running locally. Now, for some applications, that can stop the app running because a lot of apps are very, very network dependent, and reach out to some sort of online server. But many apps can also run locally with no network connectivity required at all. So the firewall's not going to do much beyond stopping applications communicating across the network. But in terms of running it, the firewall's got no ability to absolutely definitively block an application from being launched. So our best option here is anything that allows application allow listing. Whether that be something like using App Locker in Windows or Threat Locker, not sponsored, or some such other similar tool. A user reports that a Windows application frequently becomes unresponsive. What should the technician try first? I'm sure this is sounding like a broken record, but remember, they're asking for what we should try first. And as soon as we see that, we want to keep in mind that a lot of the options are probably going to be good, viable, and probably part of our troubleshooting tool set. So we need to think about what would be my first logical step. Let's see what the options are. Reinstall the operating system. Jeez. Bit of an extreme response, but hey. Option B, end the task using Task Manager. C, replace system RAM. Or D, update the motherboard BIOS. So reverting back to the question again, just to remind ourselves what's the issue we're dealing with. A Windows app frequently becomes unresponsive. What should you try first? Well, the first thing you would want to do if an application tells you it's not responding in Windows is pop open Task Manager and end the task to see if you can close it. And then the next step would be to relaunch it and see if you can recreate the particular conditions that were present at the time the thing stopped responding. Replacing or upgrading RAM might be the solution because the application might be short on memory. Either just after it launches or after maybe a little bit of time running, it's reached a point where the system does not have enough RAM and the application freaks out. So that could potentially be what's happening and causing the application to become unresponsive. But the first thing I want to do is close the application and see if I can relaunch it. And Task Manager would be great for that. So I'm not too thrilled about that as an option. Reinstalling the operating system. That's a bit of an extreme response to this problem. Not to say I wouldn't get to a point ever where reinstalling the operating system is the sensible thing to do, but it is a very intense way to deal with something that is relatively contained and isolated to one particular application. Because it says here that a Windows application is frequently becoming unresponsive. Updating the motherboard's BIOS, it potentially could fix an issue. I have encountered situations where sometimes a firmware update to a hardware component can fix a software issue due to how things interoperate and interact in the back end of an operating system. It can sometimes fix the issue, but I'm not going to have that as my first point of call when it comes to troubleshooting such a scenario. So the best option here is to use Task Manager. If this feels a little bit too straightforward, too easy, etc., sometimes the questions are like this, where the right answer is like, nah, come on, a user could do that. That's too easy. Sometimes that's the thing that they're asking you for. And remember, some users are too afraid to open things like Task Manager and click on End Process because they're afraid they're going to break something. So using the exact tools that were created for users to sort themselves out is sometimes what you're going to do first. And even if the user says they did it before, cool, I want to see it myself. I want to see what's going on so that I might spot something that a user doesn't. Which Windows file system supports file encryption, permissions, and large files? Now, with a question like this, you're probably already starting to think of a couple of examples and options that you'll recall from Windows and its capabilities. But let's see what options they put forward to us. FAT32, exFAT, NTFS, and ext4, which we can straight away eliminate option D because that's a Linux file system. It does support encryption, permissions, and large files, but it's Linux, not Windows, so out of the equation straight away. FAT32 and exFAT are both old, have security limits on how well they can protect files with encryption and apply permissions to manage access, and generally don't do well with large files. NTFS is the best option here. NTFS has something called EFS built into it, which is the encryption capability. It's got a robust set of permissions for both local and share permissions, and they can be extended with policy settings and extensions to the operating system. And it does pretty well handling files that are pretty big in size. So NTFS is the best answer for this. FAT32 and exFAT are usually kept around for supporting interoperability between different environments, like when I have to plug a flash drive into a Mac OS or a Linux machine, or even an embedded appliance that might not be running a conventional operating system. That's what those file systems are for. An employee receives an urgent email requesting them to click a hyperlink and log in to avoid account suspension, in quotation marks. Which type of attack is this? If you're thinking social engineering, I'm happy you're thinking that, but let's see what options we have. Tailgating, phishing, shoulder surfing, and spoofing. All four of these technically fall under the umbrella term of social engineering. But it's definitely not tailgating, because tailgating is usually relying on someone to open an access control door, and the threat actor, intruder, whatever you want to call them, slips in behind that person that opened the door before it closes. And this question is dealing with an email, so no. Phishing, pretty good option, because a lot of phishing campaigns do read like this, where you get an email telling you to go and do something. It's not specific to an individual, and odds are it's going to just be hoping to catch one or two people. Remember, a key thing about phishing that you want to keep in mind is that it's more like fishing with a net than fishing with a rod. The reason why I want you to think of it as fishing with a net is, even if some people do slip through the net, doesn't matter to the attacker as long as someone gets caught. And something like this, there probably will be somebody in the workplace who believes this is a valid email and they must do what it says, otherwise they're going to have their account suspended. But let's have a look at the other options. Shoulder surfing, again, this is more of a physical thing. Shoulder surfing is where I would sit behind you and watch what you're doing. See what you're doing on the screen, and if I angle myself right, see what you're typing as well. That's shoulder surfing. So again, both are in-person threats. This is completely electronic. This is an email. Spoofing. There could have been spoofing involved with the email to give it credibility, but it's not mentioned in the question at all. So because of that, I'm not too keen to say spoofing. It's a phishing campaign that's being done here. Which version of Windows 11 does not have full support for RDP? Let's see which options we have. So we've got Windows 11 Education, Windows 11 Enterprise, Windows 11 Home, and Windows 11 Pro. Now, they're looking for full support for RDP. Now, what happens with the remote desktop protocols, you've got something called RDP Server and RDP Client. And what this means is, if a Windows system supports the RDP server role, it means it supports remote desktop protocol connections to it. If it has RDP client, what that means is it supports remote desktop connections coming from it. Now, Windows 11 Enterprise, as you can imagine, would support both. Windows 11 Pro also supports both. Pro and Enterprise are very similar in terms of feature sets, obviously with Enterprise having a couple of extra features, and the main difference being how the licensing is handled. And then Windows 11 Education will support both as well, whereas Windows 11 Home supports the client, but not the server role. So you can remote from a Windows 11 Home machine, but not into it with RDP. Next question. An administrator is working on a script to automate an important task on Windows clients and Windows servers. Cool. Which of the following file types would guarantee the best compatibility across various Windows machines? So before we even look at the options, let's unpack the question a bit. This is a question about scripting and automating your work. Cool. And they're very precise about the fact that this is going to be for Windows systems, specifically clients and servers, and it must work smoothly on every form of Windows. So let's see what options they have for us. So we've got .py, .vbs, .sh, and .ps1. So let's break it down. .py, that's the file name extension used for Python applications and Python scripts. VBS is Visual Basic Scripting. SH is shorthand for shell, which is usually associated with Linux. And PS1 is for PowerShell. Now, as soon as I mentioned Linux for the .sh option, you're probably thinking, yeah, that's not going to work well given the question is Windows, Windows, Windows. VBS or Visual Basic Scripting, that can apply to Windows, but Visual Basic Scripting isn't the ideal approach for guaranteeing compatibility across various Windows machines if Visual Basic Scripting has not been enabled. Python, you can put together a Python script and run that on any system as long as the Python environments are installed, like a Python interpreter, but that's not going to be straightforward. You want something that guarantees best compatibility. And if the Python utilities are not downloaded and installed and configured correctly, a Python script is not going to work. PowerShell is the best option. PowerShell is exclusively a Windows utility at the moment, at least as far as the .ps1 scripts are concerned. And that would work smoothly and beautifully on any Windows computer. You might have a couple security prompts that you have to agree to, but otherwise it will be a flawless implementation for this scenario. The admin wants a script that will work well on any Windows computer, be it a client or a server. And PowerShell is probably one of the better options here for that. Which of the following would a video streaming service use to reduce instances of piracy? This can be interesting. Let's see what the options are. EULA, DRM, TOS, and NDA. So first, let's remember what these acronyms are because that can mess with you a bit. First one is an end user license agreement. Second one is digital rights management. Third one is terms of service. Sometimes the O is written in lowercase. And NDA is non-disclosure agreement. So let's run through them. The end user license agreement is that thing that you have to agree to as part of the installation process for most software. That thing you never read. That establishes ownership rights, usage rights, what's considered acceptable, unacceptable, and illegal criminal use of the software, stuff like that. But this is a video streaming service, not a software developer. So, if this was a software application, then I probably would have said yes. The EULA is a way of trying to reduce instances of piracy by saying, hey, by not paying for this thing, you are basically stealing it and violating the agreement. So it does give legal precedent and credence to prosecute anybody who might be pirating an application, but they're focusing on video streaming here. DRM, or Digital Rights Management, is a mechanism used to try and prevent multimedia piracy, especially for any sort of streamed multimedia, and that fits this question pretty damn well. Now, it's not a guarantee to stop it, but it definitely will reduce instances of piracy in various ways depending on exactly what the DRM solution does. Terms of service technically could fall under this question as the correct answer if DRM didn't exist as an option. And the reason why is because when you are a customer of a streaming service, you agree to a terms of service or a terms and conditions page. And odds are somewhere in that text that you never ever read is going to be something that would say, hey, this is considered piracy and illegal usage of the streaming service. And if you're doing that, you're in trouble because you agreed to that digital contract. Speaking of digital contracts, NDA, or non-disclosure agreement. An NDA is not applicable here. What an NDA is, it's something that is used so that I can share some information with you that could be considered sensitive, private, confidential, restricted, whatever, and has significant monetary value. And if you share that information before the NDA expires, you are going to be in a lot of legal trouble. So it's an agreement that you're not going to talk about something that you're about to learn about. So an NDA is definitely not the answer here. So of the first three, yes, they can deal with piracy either through legal agreements or by some sort of preventative countermeasure. But DRM is the best option for this particular thing. Terms of service might have applied, but because we had a better option, I'm going for DRM. And if they were talking about software piracy rather than video streaming piracy, the EULA might have been the better answer here. But again, a question like this will depend quite a lot on what options are being presented. But we'll go with DRM for this one. A user reports that they lost their phone, which has access to work resources in a taxi. I'm going to assume that they lost the phone in the taxi and that it doesn't have access to work resources only when it's in a taxi. What should the technician do? Well, let's see what the options are. Attempt to remotely track the device, attempt to remotely wipe the device, attempt to remotely lock it, and attempt to remotely back it up. Now, this is another one of those annoying questions because all four options are pretty good. Now, when it comes to a question like this in a CompTIA exam, this is the assumption you go on. The device is no longer in the user's possession. So, the knee-jerk reaction CompTIA wants as an answer is that you remotely wipe the device. That's the exam answer. In the real world, you might want to maybe remotely lock the device first, remotely track it second to work out if it's lost and if it's recoverable. Regardless, back the device up, and if it's unrecoverable, then wipe it. That might be your real world response. But for exam purposes, CompTIA wants one answer here, and the knee-jerk answer is to wipe the device because it's no longer in the user's possession, but it does have access to work resources. I just hope for that user's sake that they have not been storing personal stuff on this phone. And if they have, they've been backing it up or synchronizing it somehow to minimize on the risk of loss of their own personal stuff. Which of the following is suitable for a business Wi-Fi network, but not a home Wi-Fi network when it comes to security? This could be interesting. So we have to look at the options here to be able to figure it out. We can't try and make a guess before. So we've got WPA2-802.1x, WPA3-PSK, WPA2-PSK, and WEP. Now, straight away, I'm going to kill WEP. WEP is a bit of a red herring because WEP, or wide equivalent privacy, is not secure anymore. It was our first attempt at wireless security and encryption, and back when it was first introduced, it was pretty decent. But by modern standards, WEP will not stand up to even a kid with the right tools installed on their computer. So that leaves us with the WPA2 and WPA3 options. And again, another thing to watch out for is not to pay too much attention to the version of WPA, but to rather pay attention to this extension at the end here. PSK is short for appreciate key, which is that passphrase-based method or password-based method, where we all type in the same common passphrase. That's why I refuse to call it a password, to gain access to the network. Technically, yes, WPA3 is better than WPA2 when it comes to a cryptographic standpoint, but everybody is still using the same common passphrase. And we're looking for something that's going to be good for a business network, but not necessarily ideal for a home network. And in that case, it's this, the 802.1x, which is the IEEE standard for network access control, facilitated through a AAA server, such as Radius. So recapping what that means, to gain access to the network, you have to authenticate using a unique set of credentials that belongs to each individual user. So Bob will have their own set of credentials, Sally will have her own, and every other user will all have their own unique credentials. Usually these credentials will be validated by an authentication, authorization, and accounting server, and the credentials can operate independently or linked to your domain credentials. Choice is yours. Now, this will be great for a work network because that means that even though I know my credentials, I'm not going to share them with somebody who's asking if they can get information to connect to the Wi-Fi at work, because I know that it's my username, it's my password that I chose, or whatever the credentials are. And that means that if I give it to somebody else and they use it to gain access to the network, all of their actions will tie back to me, and I don't want to be in trouble for what they do. So that'll be great in a work network. But how many people can you imagine will want to go and set something up like this on their home network? Very, very few people. So the best answer here is WPA2 802.1x or enterprise mode as it might be labeled. Now, yes, WPA2 encryption isn't that strong anymore and WPA3 is better, but we're looking for ideal for a business network, not so much for a home network. If the question gave me WPA3 with 802.1x or enterprise, I probably would have gone for that answer. So that's the better choice there. All right, next question. The CEO's laptop has a hardware fault and it will take a day for the replacement part to arrive. The CEO needs the laptop before the end of the day as they are flying out to a conference. So we've got a bit of a time problem with getting this machine fixed. The technician moves their HDD to an identical laptop model they have in stock as a spare. However, when the technician tries to boot the laptop, they are met with a drive encryption prompt. What does the technician need to continue resolving the CEO's problem? So hopefully you're getting a couple of ideas popping up into your head, but let's see what options are presented. First, the UEFI password. Option B, domain admin credentials. C, the CEO's password. Or D, the BitLocker recovery key. So let's work through this and eliminate stuff. This is a drive encryption issue, so we're not even seeing the login screen. So getting the CEO's password will not help us here. Nor will having domain admin credentials. We're not trying to add this computer to a domain, we're not trying to change its domain properties whatsoever. That leaves us with a UEFI password, which remember is firmware, and the BitLocker recovery key. Now those of you who thought BitLocker straight away, you're onto the right path here, because BitLocker is a drive encryption service. And when a BitLocker encrypted hard drive detects that it's been transplanted into another computer, it will not decrypt. That is assuming it is in TPM mode, which in a large organization, the kind that would have a CEO, would probably be using. Now, in terms of what the technician is currently seeing, the drive encryption prompt they're probably seeing is the BitLocker recovery menu. When BitLocker sees that it's been transplanted to a new computer, it usually asks you for the 48-character recovery key so that you can decrypt and disable BitLocker if you are an authorized individual who happens to have access to that recovery key. Now, given the situation where we're trying to transplant the hard drive into a spare laptop so we can get the CEO onto their flight before the spare part for their original laptop arrives, we would probably want to be disabling BitLocker with the recovery key, then re-enabling it with the new computer's details like its TPM serial number and all that stuff, so that the CEO's laptop will be protected while they're away on the conference. So BitLocker is the right answer here. The reason why it's not a UEFI password is similar to a password for a more traditional BIOS-based firmware. It's just a password that protects your firmware settings. And it's unlikely that your firmware settings are being used to encrypt your hard drive. It can be done, but it highly depends on the particular model of laptop in this case, and what the firmware, in this case UEFI, is capable of. So the right answer here is the BitLocker recovery key. Which of the following allow for the use of commands on Windows? Choose 2. So let's see what our options are. We've got terminal, bash, cmd, PowerShell, and xterm. I'll give you a chance to think about the options that you think are right. But what we have to do is a bit of process elimination. It's not terminal, as that is usually the name of the command line interpreter that you see for Linux. Same as xterm as well. We have an older one, but it is a little command line interpreter for a Linux machine with a graphical user interface. Then we've got bash. This is a Linux shell. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the command line interface, it's just the shell service that runs by default on most Linux distributions, or at least the kind that you would probably start playing with at this point in your life. So it's not that one. Remember, we're focusing on a Windows system, and that is your command prompt and PowerShell being your two command line options in a Windows operating system. Command prompt is the older DOS style of command line, and PowerShell is the newer Windows-centric style of commands. So our options and answers here is C and D for our choose 2. A technician is troubleshooting a user's Windows 11 laptop that is experiencing issues accessing domain resources. When they connect an Ethernet cable, they can access domain resources. But when they connect to the office Wi-Fi, they cannot access domain resources, but can still browse the internet. What is most likely the cause of the issue? Now, with such a scenario, I'm pretty sure you've got a couple of ideas stewing in your mind already. Entertain those for a moment, but let's look at the options. The user is signed into a Microsoft account as option A. For option B, the user's Wi-Fi MAC address is being blocked. Option C, a security policy is preventing the user from accessing domain resources wirelessly. And option D, the Wi-Fi is set to public network for the network location. I don't think the Microsoft account will have much to do with this. One of the reasons why you might feel drawn to this, though, is the fact that with Windows 11, you have to sign in with a Microsoft account or a domain account. You can't have a local user account. So that could be something that would draw you to that option. Option B, the user's Wi-Fi MAC address is being blocked. I would have felt that to be the correct answer if it weren't for the fact that it says here they can still access or browse the internet when they're on the Wi-Fi. Now, if the user's Wi-Fi MAC address was being blocked, in other words, the MAC address that is part of their wireless network card, they wouldn't even be able to browse the internet. They just basically get no Wi-Fi in the little system tray in the bottom right corner of their screen. So that leaves us with option C and D now. Option C is a security policy is preventing the user from accessing domain resources wirelessly. This is plausible if such a security policy has been configured and has been deployed and applied onto this user's computer. What is more likely, though, is option D. Whenever you connect to a new network with Windows, Windows will usually ask you, is this network private or safe, yes or no? And if you say yes, it'll then work out, is it a home network or a work network, and apply the appropriate firewall rules. But if you say no, it's not a private or safe network, then Windows will apply the public network rule set of its firewall. And that would probably prevent most domain protocols and services from working. So I'm knee-jerking to this because this is more likely. And it's also very easy to check. You can either hop into the wireless network settings in the settings menu, or if you still prefer the old-fashioned control panel, go to the Network and Sharing Center. And you should be able to see whether the wireless connection is listed as private or public. If it's listed as public, this is what's causing the issue. If you go and fiddle with the network location setting and change it to private, good chance the domain resources will suddenly become available and accessible. Thereafter, option C becomes more likely. So not to say C is wrong, but it's definitely not the most likely cause for the issue. And believe you me, users will often click the wrong answer when they get prompted the first time they connect to a new network when it comes to the whole yes or no, safe or not safe. Which of the following utilities can a technician use to ensure that a domain-joined Windows client has the latest policies and configurations applied? This should be interesting. Hopefully you're picturing the kind of options you'd like to see, but let's see what we have. PSExec, GPEdit, GPResult, and GPUpdate. So PSExec, it's basically a remote administration utility in Windows. A Microsoft-only replacement, essentially, for Telnet. That leaves us with GPEdit, GPResult, and GPUpdate. So, the policies they're talking about are probably group policy, based on the options presented. GPEdit is the tool you'll use to edit, create, and modify group policy and local policy templates. So, that's not going to be the right one. And the reason why is because this is something the technician needs to use to check that a policy has been applied to the computer. GPResult is a pretty good option because it shows you which policies have applied. But here's the catch. The question isn't just asking us to see which ones have applied, but also to ensure the client has the latest as well. And in that case, GPUpdate is probably the better answer. And the reason why is this command utility is going to tell the client to go and check with the domain controller if there are new group policies to apply right away. instead of waiting for the time interval that the computer will check on its own. So GP update, possibly even with the /force option, would be the right answer for this. And if I want to be double sure that the latest and greatest group policies have applied, then I would look at using GP result. So although GP result does help us with just checking that they've been applied, GP update will make sure we've got the newest one and have applied them, which is probably going to be more effective. This is another one of those questions where we get two good answers, but one is a bit better. And in this case, GP update's the better one. It appeals to ensuring the latest have been applied, and then we could always use GP result later to see that the latest policy template version number is appearing there. A technician has been tasked with migrating a team of users to Windows 11. They have been asked to preserve the user's files, but to make sure that no problems or issues persist in the new installation. Which strategy would work best? So our first option is to install Windows 11 using a master image to reduce post-installation setup time. That is something I'd generally like to do, but I don't know if that's actually going to address the question properly. Let's see the other options first and then we'll talk about them. Perform an in-place upgrade. That is probably one of the quicker, easier ways. Back up the user data and perform a clean install. And then option D, perform a remote network installation. So let's recap what they're asking us for. We're migrating to Windows 11. They want us to keep the user's data, but we want to make sure no problems or issues follow us into the new installation. So a clean install would definitely appeal to the no problems in the new installation from previous installation. The in-place upgrade wouldn't help. And the reason why is because an in-place upgrade will keep settings and configurations, and in some cases, the settings and configurations from a previous version of Windows can cause weird problems and unexpected outcomes in a new version of Windows. Speaking from unpleasant experience here. So I'm not too mad about the in-place upgrade as an answer. And in terms of preserving the user data, or their files, backing up their data would be a pretty good option. So this is looking pretty strong. Now that is probably going to be our best answer considering the others. A remote network installation, it doesn't really address anything in this question here. It's kind of like, yeah, you could, but it's not going to have any effect on whether you're preserving user data files and preventing problems from the previous version of Windows that was on their computer. It's just a different way of installing. Instead of sitting there in front of the computer, you're doing it through the network using a deployment service of some kind. And then option A, installing Windows 11 using a master image to reduce post-installation setup time. Hey, that could be part of your clean install. But it's got nothing to do with preserving the user's data and avoiding previous configuration problems appearing in the new version of the operating system. A technician has been asked to make sure that all computers of customer-facing employees have a standard wallpaper with the company logo displayed. Which tool will help implement this change? So we have system configuration, personalize, task scheduler, and group policy. So what we're trying to do here is apply a consistent configuration to all computers that fall under a group of people that would be customer facing. Group policy is sounding like a pretty good option here. If I dig around the group policy templates enough, I am sure I will come across a setting that lets me control what the background wallpaper is. And while I'm at it, I'll probably also look for a group policy template setting that would let me also prevent users from being able to change the wallpaper themselves, so that even after it's applied, the user cannot alter it back to whatever they want it to be. Now, if you're feeling this is a bit invasive, remember, these are company computers. The staff are customer facing. I don't want to run the risk of somebody choosing a wallpaper that is inappropriate or possibly offensive to the customer who sees it. I'm not trying to do this to the person's personal computer. Behind closed doors, you can do whatever you like on your computer, within reason. But group policy is aimed at enterprise machines that are part of the domain. I will not force these settings on an end user's personal device. But then the customer-facing employee probably shouldn't be using their personal device for work anyway. So I'm feeling good for group policy, but what's wrong with the other ones? Well, The problem with system configuration is this handles things like your boot settings and stuff like that. That doesn't really do anything to the wallpaper. Personalize? Yes, technically that is where you go and set your wallpaper, background image, the OS's color scheme, all of that stuff. But this is for a user and it's done on an individual level. So yes, we could use that. But now I'm going to have to send a technician to each and every one of the customer-facing computers and have that applied. And the problem is, if I rely on that method to apply a consistent company wallpaper, the users can probably go and change it as soon as the technician leaves. So it's not a solid option. Technically, yes, it is a way to set your wallpaper, but it's not the right answer given the situation that they're trying to deal with in this question. Task scheduler, you could argue in a convoluted way, is the answer. I could, for example, create a little script that goes and applies the company wallpaper as the background image and set that to happen every morning, 6 a.m. or the nearest time the computer is on thereafter. But that is a really convoluted way to achieve that. And again, if Task Scheduler can do it, the user can probably go and undo it or reverse it. So I'm not going to go with that. Even though I could do it, Task Scheduler is too convoluted a solution compared to group policy. Which of the following commands on Windows will allow you to identify the contents of the current folder? I'm hoping you're already thinking of the correct answer. Let's see if it appears in the options. So we have ls, pwd, dir, and cd. Now hopefully you recognize ls and pwd as Linux commands. They're asking Windows command here. So not pwd and not ls. But you might have got a little bit attracted to ls if you paid attention during the Linux videos. And the reason why is because that is the command you would use on Linux to see the contents of the current directory, or folder if you prefer the term folder. Thing is though, we're working on a Windows computer, not a Linux machine. And I know there are ways to get Linux commands to work on a Windows machine, but we have to go on the assumption we're trying to do a pure Windows operation here. So that leaves us with dir and cd. cd is used to change directory or folder. Dir, which is short for directory, will show you the contents of that directory or folder in the Windows command line. So that's the command we're going for, not cd. And for those of you who wanted to put in the comments now, but cd is a Linux command, yes, you do use cd in Linux to change directory, but it's not unique to Linux. You actually use cd in Windows as well. Even Microsoft calls a folder a directory in the command line. The only reason why we use the term folder is because that's the visual icon that was chosen to represent a directory. A little yellow cardboard folder used to keep papers organized. And because of that particular icon being chosen, we eventually just started calling them folders instead of calling them directories. A proposed change was not approved of by the CAB, the Change Advisory Board, the people that decide whether a change is approved or not. Okay, going back to the question. Citing concerns around the change failing with insufficient recovery options and methods. What can be reviewed and improved upon to get the change approved? This should be interesting. Our options are A, the benefits list. That's assuming you even do a benefits list in your change proposals. B, the risk assessment. C, the change methodology. Or D, the rollback plan. Now, let's look at the reason for refusal. Concerns around the change failing and insufficient recovery options and methods. So the benefits list, definitely not going to actually help the Change Advisory Board approve you. You can try and add 100 more benefits, but the reason why they rejected it was not they didn't see value in the change, but they saw too much risk in things going wrong. Now, the fact I just used the word risk makes you think, okay, is it risk assessment? Possibly. In the risk assessment section, you're meant to identify the risks of doing the change and also the risks of not doing the change, but not necessarily the risks with the change being done per se, more about the risks after the change is done. So let's say, for example, the change is to move from Windows 10 to Windows 11. There are obviously going to be risks of doing the actual change, but the risk assessment section here is to identify what are the risks of using Windows 11 versus staying on 10. That's the point of the risk assessment there. So not really identifying risk with methodology, but more outcomes. Now I just use the word methodology. Is it the change methodology? Well, that could help. A more solid structure and plan to go and implement your change could alleviate their concerns, but we've got the rollback plan here. Your rollback plan, or your back out strategy as it also might be known, is your idea and process that you're going to follow if the change starts going badly. And they cited their concerns were, what if the change fails? You haven't got a fleshed out plan here. It's not certain enough that we will be able to revert the alterations we have done and get the system back to the state it was at before we began the change. So though yes, a more solid change methodology would probably be a good idea, improving your rollback plan will be a better idea. A technician has been asked to go set up a new wireless router at a staff member's home as part of an initiative to make remote users more secure. If you're going to support remote workers, this is actually a pretty good initiative. What is the first setting that should be changed when the technician unboxes and connects the new wireless router? Okay, now what's really kind of cool about this question is the scenario about a more secure remote worker setup initiative is really cool. It's a neat bit of context. But if we step back, the question is essentially asking us, what are some of the first settings we should alter on any kind of wireless home router, whether it be used for just personal home usage or remote work usage? What are the good practices with initial setup? So let's see. Wi-Fi SSID, wireless encryption mode, default passwords, and firewall options. And again, this is one of those annoying questions where all options are pretty good and are things you definitely should be changing to help improve your security. So let's quickly run through why each of them is a good thing. Changing the SSID, the string of characters, basically the name of your wireless network, is going to be helpful for security, at least in the sense that if you name it well, it implies who the network is for. So let's say the remote user we're setting up here is Bob. I will call this Bob's Wi-Fi. That simple SSID implies who this network is for. Not Jeff, not John, not Jack, not whoever lives next door to Bob. It's for Bob. So that actually is a very useful thing to do. If you call the wireless network Hack This Wi-Fi, please don't be surprised one day when you see it's been changed to Challenge Accepted. Then we have the wireless encryption mode. Not a bad thing to look at and consider changing. Depending on the home router that you've got here, it might be running WPA2, it might be running WPA3. Most home routers do generally default to one of those two. But if it is using WPA2 and is capable of WPA3, and all of the user's wireless devices are also capable of WPA3, you might as well go for the stronger, better wireless encryption mode. Then, default passwords. And I like that it's pluralized, because this could mean either changing the default admin password or the Wi-Fi password, which I hate calling it a password. It's more of a passphrase because it's common knowledge to anybody who's meant to know it. But those are two good options there. And then firewall options. Now first I want to preface this with if available. Not every home router has some sort of firewall setting. And those that do might not offer that much useful stuff. But it is definitely something I would explore and figure out what the settings and configurations can do, and then use the ones that would improve the network security for the home user. So all four of these are pretty good options. But what should we do first? First thing I want to do is change the default passwords. The reason why I want to do that is if I'm a hacker wandering around doing some war driving, basically looking for weak networks when I drive around the neighborhood, and I see a default SSID, like make and model of the router, for example, as the SSID, I will then go and look up on my own internet connection what are the default credentials for that make and model, and I'll try and use that to connect. So even if I leave the SSID and the wireless encryption mode on their defaults, if I went and changed those settings. It's going to make the attacker's life that much more difficult. And if the attacker is a mischievous friend who's visiting this user at home, and they plug themselves into the Ethernet jack on the router, they could try and type in the default gateway's IP address in their browser, and then try admin and whatever the common password would be. And if we've changed that, they're not going to get in. They're not going to be able to tamper with any settings. So that would be my first point of call. Then I would probably go to changing the SSID as my second thing to do. Reviewing and altering the encryption mode as my third thing. And maybe reviewing the firewall options as my fourth or later thing. So the best first step here is to change the default passwords ASAP. And that minimizes on the period of time that this network could be attacked. But ultimately, all of these things should definitely be reviewed and adjusted accordingly. Next up, a technician is upgrading hardware in a server. Cool. They are concerned about damage from electrostatic discharge. Rightly so, and this is a concern you should have regardless of whether you're working on a server, desktop, or a laptop. Which of the following would best resolve this concern? Battery backup, thermal paste, ESD wrist strap, and an anti-static mat. So first of all, electrostatic discharge or anti-static protections basically are what we're interested in here. Battery backup and thermal paste have got nothing to do with ESD risks. So that very quickly brought us down to just two options. A ESD wrist strap or anti-static wrist strap, or an anti-static / ESD proof mat. Both would be pretty good, but I'm going to gravitate more towards the anti-static wrist strap because I can clip that wrist strap to the chassis of the server or any other valid grounding point. And this can be done whether I'm dealing with a server that's got pull-out rails and I'm working on it while it's just hanging out the server rack. Or I could use it when I pull the server completely out of the rack and put it on a workbench or a crash cart or anything like that. So it'll work out nicely there. The anti-static mat would only really help if I'm going to take the server out of the rack and put it on a workbench. And even then, it just protects the computer parts if I place them directly on the workbench. So yes, it's a good thing to have, but the wrist strap's going to be a more for less kind of deal. I'm going to get way more anti-static protection with the wrist strap for one single thing compared to the amount of anti-static protection I'll get for just the mat alone. So I'm going to go for the wrist strap. Ideally, I'd like to have as much going for me as possible when it comes to static protection when working with server hardware. And if you need to ask me why, go look at the price of server hardware. Which NTFS permission allows a user to view files and folders but prevents them from modifying or deleting anything? And this is interesting. So let's see what the options are. Full control, modify, read and execute, and write. So let's see. We want the person to be able to view files but not be able to do modification or deleting. So full control, definitely not an option here. If I give someone full control permissions to a folder or file of any kind, that person effectively has the same amount of control that the file owner has, which is pretty much all of it. Modify is like full control with some of the more extreme options taken away. The person's allowed to obviously read, write, and also make some alterations to properties about the file. Generally, though, they can't alter the permissions on the file. That's one thing I can guarantee that modify would normally prohibit. Read and execute, that's actually looking pretty good because that would allow the person to view the file, run it if it's a program, but usually not edit it in any way. Whether that be actually editing content or editing properties about the file. So that would definitely stop them from modifying or deleting the file or the contents within it. So that's looking pretty good. The write permission in Windows is best remembered as this permission lets you read and write the content of a file. I do admire Microsoft's choice in naming that because it's pretty simple. And anybody who says, yeah, but what about the read permission? You kind of need to be able to read if you can write. It's kind of common sense. So I do like the simplicity of the name. But does it help with the question? Well, yes, you would be able to view the files, but you'd also be able to make content changes, which would be modification or deleting. So I'm not thrilled about that. The best option here to meet the requirements the question is putting on us, view the file but not be able to change anything, is read and execute. That is the most applicable here. Alrighty, last question. A salesperson is unable to log into their work email on their phone. They inform the technician that the last time it worked, they were on a business trip in another country. Which of the following should the technician try first? Option A, apply a mobile OS update. Option B, verify the date and time settings. Option C, reboot the phone. Or option D, uninstall and reinstall the email client. And yet again, we've got a question where we've got 4 options that could potentially make a difference to this problem. So let's review. Could a mobile OS update be the reason why they're not getting emails? Possibly. It might be a version compatibility issue if maybe the email app updated but the OS didn't. But they said it was working on a business trip in another country recently. So if we look at the next option, which is verify the date and time settings, they were in another country recently. If they manually changed the time zone or manually set the date and time because they're in another country, that can lead to a time synchronization error occurring when it comes to emails. I've seen this happen a number of times when time and date settings are manually configured, and even time zone settings are manually configured. Because if the difference between the client device's time and the email server's time is too significant, you could land up with a situation where the client is, let's say, time-wise in the future, and the server is saying, well, I've already delivered the mail to you, because you said to me it's now this time that you last checked it, and that is far in the future for me. It causes weird issues. So that's a pretty strong contender here, especially given the context information about this was a business trip and they were in another country. And if that country was a different time zone, very strong chance the person might have manually changed the date and time settings on their phone. Now, if you're wondering, why would someone do that? You could be dealing with the type of person who is used to an analog wristwatch, the kind that you have to adjust the time, and if it's got the date feature, you'd have to adjust it yourself when you travel to another time zone. And people who are used to that paradigm with a wristwatch might think they've got to do the same thing with their electronic devices too, instead of just letting geolocation and network time protocol sort everything out like it's meant to. Rebooting the phone. Could that be an option? Yeah. You'd be surprised how often the advice of have you tried rebooting the phone actually can solve some issues. But if it's the date and time settings that have been adjusted, rebooting the phone won't make a difference. Could be tried, but I definitely know I could go and check date and time settings quickly, much faster than I could reboot the phone. So I'm still feeling good about option B. And then uninstalling and reinstalling the email client app. Again, that could be a viable option. Sometimes things go haywire with some applications, and just uninstalling it, reinstalling it, and doing any sign-ins you have to again, and possibly any setting changes within the app if you need to, again, is not the worst thing if it fixes the problem. Yeah, it's a bit annoying, it's a bit of an inconvenience, but if it makes the problem go away, that annoying, inconvenient solution is kind of worth doing. But would it necessarily fix an email sync error? I'm really interested in the fact this is a salesperson and they're in another country recently. That bit of information given to us in the scenario was not put there for fun. This is there for context. And sometimes we need to rely heavily on context clues when troubleshooting. And I'm pretty confident that the date and time settings on this device have probably been adjusted. Not to say I wouldn't check for updates or reboot the phone or uninstall and reinstall the email client app, but I'm definitely going to check the quick and easy thing first, which is, in this case, date and time settings, given the context information. Well, that was 50 questions that hopefully make you feel a bit more prepared for the CompTIA A Core 2 exam. Hopefully it goes well for you, and please let me know how you did in the exam. I do like to hear. And when you do pass your A+ certification, please do me a favor and don't forget to come back to this channel because I've got a series for Network Plus and for Security Plus as well. Otherwise, I'd like to say thank you very much. I really do appreciate you watching this, and I'll catch you in the next playlist.